So I have to say, as a rabbi, I get to hear a lot of people's personal stories, and I get to hear a lot of the mood in people's personal lives. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say there's a lot of despair out there right now. Anybody here feeling very optimistic and cheerful, raise your hand. Let's just see if we have. Excellent. I see 3 people over there, 2 over here. How about this section over here? Excellent. Look at that. See, I told you. So that's 2, 3, 6. How about this side? 5, 6, 7, 8. Over here, 10, 11. All right. I want all of you who are feeling optimistic and full of hope to stand up for a second. Just a second. I want everybody to give them a round of applause. And remember when I said we need to drink from the energy of people here? Now, who here is feeling despondent and full of despair? I would like you to raise your hands. Hold on, if you're not feeling optimistic and full of hope, and you're not feeling despondent and full of despair, what else is there? Just kind of in the middle? Okay, who's kacha in the middle of it all? Interesting, very interesting. Okay, the theme of my words tonight, and then you could go to sleep, is don't despair. That's the bumper sticker I'm going to leave you with, is don't despair. And even if nothing else sinks in, I want you just to carry that with you. Don't despair. Don't despair about your personal lives. Don't despair about the ability to make changes in your own life for the better. Don't despair about becoming the person that your dog thinks you are. Thank you, Lisa Kartzman. That's just such a great line. I just love that line. We actually can change. The first place we have to start is how we feel about ourselves. We actually can change. Now, I don't think it's a quick fix or that we can change everything. And that's our biggest mistake. We think if we can't change the fundamental realities of our life, changing anything isn't worthwhile. So for that, I want to reject that assumption. Rabbi Angela Bookdahl of Central Synagogue shared at Rosh Hashanah a few things that I want to share with you tonight. Have you ever heard of Russell Walker? Anybody here hear of Russell Walker? He has said God is a white supremacist and says all Jewish people descend from Satan. Who is Russell Walker? Nobody in this room has heard of him. He's a Republican candidate for a seat in the North Carolina state legislation. Have you ever heard of Steve West? He hosts a YouTube channel where he said, looking back in history, unfortunately Hitler was right. West speaks of Jewish cabals that are harvesting baby parts from Planned Parenthood. He recently won the Republican primary for a seat in the Missouri House of Representatives. Have you ever heard of John Fitzgerald? He posted a reward online of $2,000 to anybody who can prove that the official Holocaust narrative is true. He will be a Republican candidate for the California House of Representatives. Ilhan Omar is already a Democratic state representative in Minnesota and nearly certain to win a U.S. congressional seat this year. She tweeted, quote, Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. These are real candidates aspiring to run our country. Now I'm going to repeat my question. Who here is feeling optimistic? The same people we got? Yeah, excellent. That's what I love to see. We know, looking around, that the world is becoming more and more dangerous for us, those of us who are Jews. We feel a sense of vulnerability as we hear little murmurs of the things that I read, sometimes from the right and sometimes from the left. There are those on the right who use the opportunity to say that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic and therefore it can't be done. And there are those on the left who say that any support of the state of Israel is not okay and uses that word Zionism sometimes, not always, for anti-Semitic ammunition. I want to remind you of what I said 2 years ago on Yom Kippur 2016. If you can think back that far. Remember Yom Kippur 2016. I read the description of a new biography which had just come out by Ulrich about a biography of Hitler. I'm going to read tonight what I read then 2 years ago. Hitler was often described as an egomaniac who only loved himself, a narcissist with a taste for self-dramatization and a characteristic fondness for superlatives. His manic speeches and penchant for taking all or nothing risks raised questions about his capacity for self-control, even his sanity. Hitler was shrewd as a politician, with a keen eye for the strengths and weaknesses of other people and an ability to instantaneously analyze and exploit situations. Hitler was known among colleagues for a bottomless mendacity that would later be magnified by a slick propaganda machine that used the latest technology, radio, gramophone, and film to spread his message. A former finance minister wrote that Hitler was so thoroughly untruthful that he could no longer recognize the difference between lies and truth. Hitler was an effective orator and actor, adept at assuming various masks and feeding off the energy of his audiences. Although he initially concealed his anti-Semitism beneath a mask of moderation when trying to win the support of socially liberal middle classes, he specialized in big theatrical rallies, staged with spectacular elements borrowed from the circus. He adapted the content of his speeches to suit the tastes of his lower middle class, nationalist, ethnic chauvinist, and anti-Semitic listeners. He peppered his speeches with coarse phrases and put-downs of hecklers. Even as he fomented chaos by playing to crowds' fears and resentments, he offered himself as the visionary leader who could restore law and order. He presented himself in messianic terms, promising to lead Germany to a new era of national greatness. Although he was typically vague about his actual plans, he often harked back to a golden age for the country, the better to paint the present days in hues that were all the darker. Everywhere you look now, there was only decline and decay. That's what I read 2 years ago. Bimkom she'eno ish hishtadel liot ish. Pirkei Avot teaches us. In place where there is no humanity, in a place where people are not behaving like human beings, our obligation is to behave like a human being. In big and small ways, and much of our contemporary culture tells us the opposite. You know, if everybody's doing something, what's wrong with me doing it? Or if things get so coarse and so vulgar and so racist and so anti-Semitic, then what does it matter if I'm just a little bit of any of those things? Bimkom she'eno ish, in a place where there is not a human being acting like a human being, it is your obligation to continue to hold on to your humanity. A couple of stories. One of the things we did this summer when we were in Israel is we went to Yad Vashem with the children, different ages, different appropriate things we did. But when we stood on the Avenue of the Righteous, we pointed out that there was a tree planted there for Oskar Schindler. That tree was not planted in the initial years of Yad Vashem, by the way. And in fact, Yad Vashem initially refused to plant a tree for Oskar Schindler because the definition of a righteous Gentile at that time in the 50s was that they did something to save Jews, but they didn't benefit financially from it. Oskar Schindler was actually a member of the Nazi Party, and he was an industrialist who ran a factory that made a fortune Initially, Oskar Schindler used Jewish labor because it was cheaper than Polish labor. And who objected to the fact that Yad Vashem would not plant a tree to remember Oskar Schindler? The 1,200 Jews that Oskar Schindler saved. They petitioned Yad Vashem, and they said, in his work as a factory owner, he saved our lives. That man, Oskar Schindler, who was a member of the Nazi Party, saved more Jews with that one action than any other individual person in the course of the Holocaust. So was he a perfect person? He wasn't. And by the end of the war, he used his entire fortune to bribe other Nazi officials to get his 1,200 Jews, and he tried to get more and was not successful, his 1,200 Jews safe from the Auschwitz gas chambers. Here's one person who no one would look on and say, that's a saint. But he did what he could as he transformed internally from being aligned with the Nazi Party. He slowly, and in reaction to the sadism he saw, did what he could with the resources he had, which was a factory that employed 1,200 Jews. Those 1,200 Jews said to Yad Vashem, he might not have saved thousands more, but we are alive because he did what he did. As morally complicated as it might be, he saved 1,200 Jews. Is it pure? Was it everything? Was he able to stop the Nazi war machine? Was he able to stop the gas chambers? No. But he set his eyes on the 1,200 Jews who worked for him and saved them. When he died, he was then buried on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, where he is still visited by the 1,200, those are still alive, and their 10,000 descendants from those original 1,200. His grave, and remember he was a Nazi, is a place of holiness. Helen Suzman, some of you might know that name, was a South African Jewish woman. She was born a child of Jewish immigrants, and most of the Jews in South Africa were from Lithuania. And in the 1950s, she became a member of the Parliament of South Africa as a part of a party that was anti-apartheid. In 1961, everybody else from the anti-apartheid party in the parliament was voted out. She was the only one who remained. There were 160 members of the parliament, and she was the only one who was anti-apartheid. For 39 years, she was in the parliament. She was the only voice in the parliament who was anti-apartheid. Some on the left were very critical of her for remaining as part of the system and not abandoning the system entirely. But for those years, she fought against apartheid, horrific prison conditions. She visited Mandela many times in jail, as well as many other jailed activists. She was an English-speaking Jewish woman in a parliament dominated by Calvinist Afrikaner men. They hated her. In the 13 years when she was the sole representative of the Progressive Party, she gave 885 speeches and asked 2,262 questions. She would not be shut up. She was once accused by a senior minister of the government of asking questions that embarrassed South Africa. She replied, "It is not my questions that embarrass South Africa, it is your answers." She was subject to misogynist and anti-Semitic harassment and abuse by the government, by the police, by all those with whom she served in the parliament, by her neighbors, and she never stopped. She never left because she believed that there needed to remain a voice, because there would be a future that would look back and say, where were the righteous ones? She believed, she wanted there to be a voice that no one would say that there were 160 members of the parliament who supported apartheid. There were 159. She was significantly in the minority, but she didn't give up. She had a vision of the future in which she had to lay the groundwork for others to see that it's possible to speak truth, even if you don't think it will immediately make a difference. Some of you have heard this story, which I can't get away from retelling tonight. So for those of you who have heard it before, indulge me. I grew up in the 1960s, part of a Jewish community that pretty much focused on the Holocaust and Israel as reasons to be Jewish. 3 days a week, I went to a conservative Hebrew school and learned pretty much nothing, and couldn't figure out what was important about being Jewish except for Israel and the Holocaust. Very quickly, many people in my generation started being suspicious of the use of the Holocaust as having an agenda that wasn't just about honoring those who died, but something else entirely. That has changed in my life as I've come to understand that if we don't stand as witness, and if we don't actively teach our children, and if we don't actively honor those who have died, they will become really the invisible masses. While we were in Israel, last summer, before I went to Israel, a year ago this summer, I was in Europe on a CBST trip. We went to visit the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It doesn't exist anymore, but we traveled the trail of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Jews who lived there. Just checking to see if anybody's paying attention. It hasn't existed in a while, okay? We went to Vienna and Budapest and several of the small Jewish towns in Czechoslovakia and in that region. And after the trip, I went to Warsaw for 3 days, which is where my father's family is from. And I knew, as many of you have heard, the story of Janusz Korczak, who was the great Polish educator. He's very famous in Poland as an educator and a children's book author, and he worked with several different important institutions in Poland for Polish children. In 1939, he created an orphanage for the Jewish children because, of course, the ghetto was created in Warsaw, and non-Jews were in one part of Warsaw, and Jews were all located in one part of the city. They were brought from the Jews were in different communities. They were all brought to the ghetto. And Korczak, whose born name was Henryk Goldschmidt, opened the ghetto, moved his orphanage into the Jewish ghetto. And it's a very famous story that many of you, I'm sure, have heard, that on the day of deportation, he took the 196 children from the orphanage. He had them all dress in their best clothes and take their school backpacks, and he walked them through the city of Warsaw, through the entire Warsaw ghetto, to get to the point where the trains arrived. 2 trains left Warsaw every single day for about 3 months, with 7,000 people on a train every single day. Remember, before the war, there were 3.5 million Jews in Poland, and after the war, a few thousand. As the Warsaw ghetto was being emptied, Korczak walked with his children to the deportation center, which is at one end of the ghetto, and helped the children get onto the train. And the story is that a Nazi soldier who was a Polish soldier said to Korczak, "You don't have to go, you're a famous Polish author. Nobody even knows you're Jewish." He said, "No, I will go with my children. In a place where there is no humanity, I will be a human being, even in the coarsest, most despicable place of no humanity, and I will make sure my children, these 196 children, are not alone." On our trip to Israel in August, one young member of the trip had a tallis bag that his family member had made for him, he being the youngest of 15 cousins, and she made a tallis bag for each child in the family who became bar bat mitzvah. And his mothers came up to me at early part of the trip and said, "Will you bless the tallis bag sometime while we're in Israel? Do you know a good place to bless the tallis bag?" And I said, "I don't really know yet, but why don't we take the tallis bag every place we go and find a place that will be appropriate?" When we visited Yad Vashem and we went to the Children's Memorial, and we walked through that Children's Memorial, and it's all dark and there's no visual image, and you just hear the names in English and in Yiddish and in Hebrew and in Polish, the names of the children and their ages. 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered. We walked through that memorial silently, came out of the memorial and stood immediately outside of the memorial. There's a statue of Janusz Korczak holding his children. And there we did a ceremony. Some of the children on the trip read some readings which I had brought. We talked about what we had just experienced, and we started leaving that place. And Emmet, whose tallis bag it was, and whose bar mitzvah it will be sometime this year, came up to me and said, "Let's do the blessing here." Emmet, are you here tonight? Would you stand up? Here's Emmet. There's Emmet. And Emmet came up to me and he said, "I want to have my tallis bag blessed in front of Janusz Korczak." And I stood there with his mothers and with Emmet, and I blessed that tallis bag. That here, this young boy of our lesbian family and who grew up in this synagogue is going to have a bar mitzvah here to bless this bag. Now, what kind of blessing is that? It's not just the blessing that I heard a lot as a kid, which is be Jewish because there was a Holocaust. But we have to create a Judaism that will continue long beyond us. That we have to remember that we are just these incredible links in a chain of an LGBT Jewish community that's creating different kinds of families that's going to create a future for all of us. And for me, the blessing of Emmet and his family and of all the children that were on this trip and all the children in the synagogue is that we who are the adults do not have a right to despair. We do not have a right to despair. If we have to pretend we don't feel despair, we have to pretend until we feel hope, because it is our job to make sure the world will be able to look back at our generation and say there were Helen Sussmans here among us who, even though we were one of 160, we spoke truth. When we heard about children being ripped from their families because they come to this country looking for decency and safety and economic freedom and religious freedom, which, guess what, is what our people did. 96% of American Jews are descended from people who came to this country between 1881 and 1924. In 1924 was the first quotas enacted by this government in order to keep out two groups. One group were Italians and the other group were Jews from Eastern Europe. Because our two groups were considered too radical. We were bringing in left-wing and labor ideas. And guess what? There had been an anarchist who tried to kill McKinley way back when, and the anarchist was from Eastern Europe and spoke with an accent. So from the death of McKinley in 1901 to 1924, it took 20 years to pass the first quota law to keep out anybody from Eastern Europe or Southern Europe who were seen as bringing in dangerous and filthy ideas. Of course, there was an immigration law before 1924, and that was the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1800s, when Chinese men were allowed to come in to work on railroads, but were not allowed to bring in families or to stay. And of course, this country brought in one very large group of immigrants, not by voluntary choice, but Africans to be slaves to build the very foundations of our country. But we Jews, from 1924 to the 1950s, when that law was changed, help me remember, what happened between 1924 and the mid-1950s? Oh yeah, the Holocaust happened. There are 2 reasons 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. There are 2 reasons that Russian Jews were slaughtered by Stalin. There are 2 reasons. One is the fascism of the fascist dictators of the Stalins and the Hitlers, but the second is that there was no place to go. If our doors had been opened, if America had let Jewish refugees in, 6 million Jews would not have died. We have to remember that for fascism to have power, there has to be silence on the part of everyone else. Now, some people might say, oh God, there she goes again, giving a political talk on Yom Kippur, the holiest of days. But for me, there is no difference between spirituality and social justice. They are one and the same. Tomorrow we will read of the book of Isaiah from the very Haftorah for Yom Kippur, which says, don't give me a fast where you're moaning and screaming and shuckling and fasting. The fast I want, God tells us, is where we use this time to rededicate ourselves, to free the oppressed, to help the poor, to feed the hungry, and to liberate the world. That's the fast God wants from us. I have a list here that's going to be hard to read, so I'm not going to read it, of all the things that have happened since 2016. I can't even right now read it. In a place where there is no humanity, be a human being. We have one member of the congregation who, wherever she goes in the city, carries around a little Ziploc bag. She tells me originally it used to have sardines, a little fork, and a napkin in there. But then she discovered a lot of the homeless people don't like sardines so much. And she would argue with them that sardines are really great for the omega oil, and they're really good, they're very good on the ecological system because they're, you know what I mean about the fish thing. This is Susan Meyer over here. Susan's here. So Susan has substituted. She no longer does sardines. She does little things of tuna fish. She says more people like the tuna fish than the sardines. She leaves her house. She has a bunch of Ziploc bags with a little tuna fish and a fork and a napkin. She walks around the city of New York. She sees somebody hungry. She hands it to them. Now, she doesn't have a chance to be a Helen Sussman and be one of 160 members of the parliament for year after year after year. And she's not going to be Janusz Korczak with an orphanage. But the point is to find something to do in the life we have that has an impact on the world in which we live. Be the reason that people believe in the goodness of humanity. Final story. This candle, which we now light at every one of our Friday night services and is with us for Yom Kippur, was given to CBST by an Austrian non-Jew who came with our trip last year when we visited the concentration of camp of Mauthausen outside of Vienna. And she came with us through our time in Vienna, and she has said, I can't change what my ancestors, her parents and grandparents' generation did in Vienna and Austria. I can't change that history. But I, as a non-Jewish Austrian, can dedicate my life to confronting that past, to not looking away from it, from looking right into the abyss, and being a witness to the pain that all those who are of the peoples that my people, the Austrians, tried to murder, who they are. After we did the time, we had quiet time where we each spent time in Mauthausen, and Mauthausen was built as a gift to Hitler because it's right near Hitler's birthplace of Linz, Germany, of Linz, Austria. After we went around the concentration camp, we sat in an empty barracks to have some quiet time and some sobbing time. And she then took out this candle and put it in the center, and she said, I come from a long line of candle makers, and I want to give you a candle to light, to be a part of creating more light in the world. Siggy, who has now become close friends with many people who went on the trip, has been in contact with me in this last week, and she knows we're going to Auschwitz and Krakow in a couple of, in November on another trip. And she's coming with us to Krakow and Auschwitz to again be a witness with us of what her people have done. Heschel said, the fascists have shown that they are great in evil. We must be as great in goodness as they are in evil. Be the reason people believe in the goodness of humanity. Be as good in the greatness of being good as the evil around us is that bad. That's our challenge. I believe that in that ability to do it, we come to a place where it's not an issue of even hope or despair. We do stuff because we can affect the world in which we find ourselves, however small or however big our platform. And we don't do it thinking we're going to see the immediate results always. We do it also, like Helen Suzman, starting in the 1950s, to say what her truth was. Like others who have lived in generations of great violence and of evil, we have to be the ones that when our children, and by our children, I mean the children of our community, I mean in 70 years, when people look back at this moment in history, will we be written in the book of life? Will we be the ones who they'll see our names or our faces or our community in the book that is giving the future life? That is our job, to be judged not only by the empirical immediate success of whatever we do, but by our belief in a future that will look back and understand we're building a future for the children in this community, for the children in the world, and so that history will look at us and see us as our deliberately writing ourselves in that book. May this be a year to forgive and be forgiven. May this be a year full of love and kindness. May ahavat chinam, may causeless love replace causeless hatred. Yidden, don't despair. Just remember I said that. Don't despair. We can build a future that will be transformed by our very acts, small and big. Gewalt Jews, do not despair. This was the call of the Warsaw Jews. This is a famous poem by Halper Leivik, a Yiddish poet. Gewalt Jews, do not despair. This was the call of the Warsaw Jews. Where will my help come from? It's not going to come from something so obvious and nearby. Where will my help come from? I look up, my eyes look up. I am down in the valley, I'm in the pit. Those of you who are in recovery understand this better than anyone who has not gone through that process. It is from being at the very bottom of the pit that we learn how to look up to the hills and say, I need help. That help doesn't always come from inside. It comes from those around, It comes from lifting our eyes up to the hills and knowing there is something better, there is something different, there is something more powerful than our own immediate life's experience. That is what faith is about. If you don't believe in yourself, believe in the person sitting next to you who is doing something spectacular with their lives in small ways. If you don't believe in yourself, look around the room. Look at the people who do something infinitely small or big. I look up to the hills. From where does my help come? My help ultimately comes from that which is unseen, that which I can't touch or feel immediately. It is the one who has made the heavens and the earth in the beauty of the oceans and the beauty of the sunsets and the beauty of love and the beauty of the flower coming up through the sidewalk. Our feet will not stumble when we have a sense of our own strength, a sense of our own community, when we know that each of us must do whatever we can to make sure that this moment in history will pass, that we don't wake up on November 8th or 9th of this year and say we did not do enough, that we don't hold ourselves back because we don't have time, because we're too tired or we're too stressed out to make an extra effort. This is the moment. If you are alive right now, it is because God is expecting you to do something great. Not big, not famous necessarily, but your soul is here to do something, to spread goodness, to be the reason people believe in goodness of humanity, to be as good as the bad people are bad, to that degree. Please, God, be with us. We need your help. We can't do this alone. We are full of gratitude for the gifts and blessings in our lives, and we dedicate ourselves to making sure this world goes on, that we take care of the animals in our world, that we take care of the climate in our world, and that we're gentle and loving with ourselves and with each other. Page 246. Esa Einai, I lift my eyes up to the hills. From where will my help come?